This video has come about as a result of the All Things Wicked chapter and Killer of the Unknown. From what I've seen, many felt quite thrown off when seeing Unknown for the first time, believing it to be presented differently in the teasers. This made me think back to other times too when teasers or full trailers sort of felt like they didn't quite align with the characters we eventually got in game. The biggest and best examples I could find for this were the Unknown, the Skull Merchant, and the Legion. All of these characters had some kind of debate surrounding the presentation of the character in the trailers and subsequently in the game. Hey everyone, and let's get into it. The first time the reality of a character was different to how trailers presented seems to be Legion, and where the whole idea of characters being misrepresented comes from. The main argument in the case of Legion is that the way they appear in game doesn't match the trailers, in this case specifically relating to their powers. The first look at Legion the World got, I believe, was this teaser picture, with Frank looking into a mirror and the other three members of the Legion looking back. I took a look at the discourse around this image at the time, and the main takeaway appears to be that people assumed the character would have multiple personalities, or the three characters appearing in the mirror were in some way a part of the one looking into it. Other theories were that these four characters were the original survivors turned bad, likely due to how human the characters appeared. There were even some Blight references which I found interesting. I think this was around the time of the very first Blighted cutscene, which is why there were probably theories surrounding that. I do find it very interesting though, seeing as Blight did eventually end up in the game. Other theories back then also suggested that maybe 4 characters would be present in the trial, and not one character with multiple personalities. It was really interesting honestly looking through because some people straight up guessed the power and even got pretty close to the characters' motivations too, sort of showing off that the teasers were pretty effective and relayed the ideas fine. The reality of Legion being a group of teenagers unhappy with the world is basically what they are, but these ideas simply got less attraction than the more out there ideas that predicted something a bit more extreme. Comparing this image to the actual Legion, and there is no connection really to these theorized ideas, but the teaser image does still relate to the final product. The Legion are all separate people, but in game all 4 members can't be present at the same time in any given trial. Therefore this reflection was simply to present them as one of the same as a group. This is how most disappointment begins when it comes to chapters like this, I think. Cases where the theories surrounding a chapter build up more hype than what the chapter ends up being, creating an imbalance and ultimately a lack of satisfaction when the reality becomes clear. What I found interesting upon reading back on the chapter 10 PTB however is that people actually weren't that surprised or disappointed by the reveal of the character and their power. If anything, this narrative around the Legion seeming misrepresented in the trailers is something that came a lot later and sort of built over time, something that happened due to Legion's power being so miserable to work with and having so many issues. It was retroactively looked at and criticized for not being some kind of deception-based ability. After all, the clearest first example we have of this deception is present in the trailer itself for the chapter, happening when Frank of the Legion runs alongside David before pulling up his hood and putting on a mask and attacking him. It's worth noting too that this trailer released after the PTB, so at this time everyone already knew Legion's power before this trailer dropped. The reasoning for Legion being portrayed in this way is more just down to Legion's visuals and design being very Survivor-like, which is absolutely meant to be the case, evident from the chapter name to the more humanized appearance of the characters and their in-game cosmetics. Part of the trailers did want you to think they had a deceptive ability to appear like a survivor, and they kind of do. I remember my first game against Legion, myself and friends genuinely believed it to be a survivor at first, before they attacked us. Sure, that's sort of a one-off time that won't happen again, but it's definitely something that their gameplay does allow. The comparative reactions to Legion then and now are sort of night and day, with the character actually getting a lot of love and excitement upon initial release. Is it fair to say that the character was misrepresented by the trailers and teasers? Honestly, I don't think so. I think the Legion were presented pretty consistently from start to finish. Although there were definite things along the way up for interpretation, none of the content of the trailers lied or even misled you really. All of it was accurate to how the character actually ended up. The main disappointment comes, I think, from the fact that other theories were created and the actual thing received received paled in comparison, because theories of course are not bound by any sort of gameplay restrictions and stuff like that. The bounds of theories come down to whether people agree on if it would be cool or not. The additional thing that added to this feeling of wanting something else and feeling misled was because the power ended up being quite problematic and sort of flopping for a lot of people. You'll notice this is a trend for the characters of this video. This is not the end of the story though, and we do have a number of other chapters to look at. I think one of the fairest cases of people being disappointed by a chapter's teasers and trailers compared to the reality is Tools of Torment and the introduction of the Skull Merchant. Whilst the teasers were quite vague and really didn't reveal much, they did definitely point to something that was much more futuristic and darker, despite the killer ending up as one of the more bright and cartoony characters whose design is based on dark manga. It's a tough one to judge, but in the case of this chapter, what we see in the trailer does actually align with the chapter and characters, but it's a case where it only sort of represents an aspect of Skull Merchant. I made a whole video specifically on Merchant's tonal flaws, but this too is a contributing factor toward a chapter feeling misleading. There's a lot going on with Merchant, and what we saw was simply an aspect of her. Skull Merchant definitely does use tools to construct skull-related pieces of tech, but it's sort of a very small part of her overall design, and it ties in very vaguely with her overall lore and visual design, which is what was disappointing in this case, I think. The other thing, of course, was the hype surrounding a futuristic chapter to begin with. A bit like with Legion, a lot of the original conceptions and ideas around an initial teaser were simply a bit more out there and exciting sounding than what we ended up getting, and so comparatively it feels like a letdown. In this case it felt like a bigger letdown though, because Merchant herself didn't present anything particularly exciting, at least for the time of her release, which was much later into DBD's lifecycle. The concept of having survivor movement as a killer back when Chapter 10 released was quite a novel concept, I think, and so despite some theories being more exciting than the reality, it was accepted because it at least introduced something kind of cool. In the case of Merchant, I think the reality was just so disappointing comparatively to people's ideas that it felt like more of a betrayal almost, and a moment of being misled. These two characters are great to compare, I think too, because they both had subsequently extremely controversial years after their release, where they went through a lot of hate and turbulence before they ended up in a more accepted spot. Further, in the case of Merchant, these were teasers where we didn't see the killer before the full trailer, meaning we had more time to speculate and picture what they could look like, rather than going off of a pre-existing image like we had with Legion. Looking at Legion and seeing Legion in-game can't really lead you to disappointment, can it? That's Legion in the picture there, and that's most definitely also the same Legion in-game. Compare this with Merchant's teasers where we see drills and skulls and lots of darker and tech-related stuff, then compare that to what she looks like in-game, and it's sort of understandable that people were surprised with what they saw, and why the live reaction was one of direct backlash. Sure, the trailers equally didn't confirm it was some futuristic cyborg, but equally they did definitely pose that it was something a bit more visually creepy than Skull Merchant. This is really the fine line teasers need to walk, I think, when it comes to presenting characters, is providing enough information that keeps the audience on the right track and excited for what's to come, but not revealing too much that it becomes obvious and boring to speculate. That's a tough line to walk too, but one that I think can absolutely be done right. The final character I want to look at is the Unknown, who is one of the most fascinating cases of a character people feel is misrepresented. It's interesting right off because the character isn't exactly meant to have a clear visual design or origin, and the whole point of the character is that everything about it is unknown. Even when we read directly about it in the lore, we have no definitive answer as to what it is. So the idea of it being misrepresented in teasers and viewers assuming it was something it isn't is honestly kind of funny, and also sort of weirdly makes the teasers that much better. The teasers were mainly created around disappearance happening in a town named Greenville, with lots of the marketing for the chapter utilizing things such as text messages, photos, and even some video when we got very close to the end. It was overall a really great experience to watch this chapter slowly unravel. These teasers sort of all seem to hint towards some kind of shapeshifter, or a creature able to mimic the voices and appearance of humans, using it as a means to put you at ease before attacking. All of it was very mysterious and unclear on what the creature was, and the depictions we had of it were all sort of quite different. The very first description we had actually pretty much perfectly describes its presentation in game. It's said to stand, but with awkwardly positioned feet, a distorted voice, and other odd features. The other kind of depiction we had was that of a pale creature crawling around on all fours, with spindly limbs and sort of a wide smiley mouth. Honestly, Honestly, this was maybe the only thing that didn't align with the teasers, was that the killer in the video parts of the teasers did seem to mainly traverse on all fours, but in-game is almost entirely standing on two legs, aside a small opening scene in the lobby. I wouldn't go so far to say as that being misleading or dishonest in the trailers though, more just an odd thing to keep focus on if it wasn't going to be a big thing. A bit like how the dark and mechanical elements of Merchant were focused on, this crawling aspect seemed to get a little too much attention for what the character was. In this case, it's understandable that people might have thought it would be a crawling character, because the footage we did see was always a crawling character, or a character low to the ground. The main visual difference aside, this is purely just a difference in visual quality, I think, but that's only natural as the difference between in-game and trailers is pretty much always different to some degree. Comparing the final product to the teaser images once more, and it all aligns perfectly fine. Overall, in most cases, I think disappointment in the reality of something mainly just stems from not having all the available information, subsequently filling it in with something that sounds cool, and being disappointed when something predicted doesn't happen. In all the cases we've looked at, the characters in game are all actually presented consistently with their teasers and trailers. After all, the purpose of these teasers often isn't to provide a complete image, but to instead provide intrigue and engagement for upcoming content. I do agree, despite that it can be disappointing when something that sounds really cool and has been theorized a lot by the community ends up not really happening. But that's also just something to accept, I think, when it comes to predicting what something mysterious might end up being. For all three characters discussed today, I definitely had a very different image of what the character was going to be before they finally came out, but that doesn't mean they failed or were deceptive really. However, admittedly, disappointing in some cases. With things like this, there's always going to be times when you'll be disappointed, but that doesn't mean what you might want won't eventually come. Sometimes even sooner than you might think.